there's really nothing I dislike more than public speaking, and that's odd for someone who's so invested in the public sphere and the public realm. I'm trained as an architect, so I'm used to building walls and separating myself from the public. One of the things that has fascinated me is this kind of sometimes invisible line between public and private. This is a piece by Vito Acconci called Following, in which he has a very simple set of rules for this performative practice where he decides to follow someone in public space, and as soon as that person goes into a private space, he waits until he sees another person and follows them in public space, and so on and so on. And by engaging in this itinerary, he actually remaps the city, and he remaps the city based on a series of individuals' experiences of publicness within the urban context. So, I don't know, 15 years ago, I arrived at MIT, very uncomfortable because my background is not in technology. I went to pretty traditional architecture schools, and when I arrived at MIT, I was very anxious. So the first thing I did was I decided I should take a course, even though I was a faculty member. So my first semester as an assistant professor, I took a course. It was called How to Make Almost Anything. So I took this course. It's at the Media Lab, taught by Neil Gershenfeld, and it's a crash course in microcontrollers and fabrication. And the final project I made for that course was the defensible dress. So now you can get a sense of my aversion to publicness, and how private I am, and how important it is for me to defend my personal space. And what's interesting is personal space is very cultural, not only is it very cultural, but the ways we define personal space and public space are very nuanced. This one isn't so nuanced. The defensible dress was made out of shape memory alloys, a microcontroller, and a sensor, and it found its way into the LA MoCA as a design project. So one of the things I think is important about creating a truly engaging public space is you have to create something that is unfamiliar. You need to defamiliarize context such that the rules of engagement are less clear. Many years ago, a decade ago actually, for the Athens Olympics, they had an international design competition to create sound and light installations around the city. And for me, the project was an opportunity to create a new urban public space that would respond to people as they move through the field. The idea was that the public would, in fact, choreograph that field. This has sound. And the lights would respond to their movement and create a kind of wake behind them as they move through that field. And the idea of whiteness was based on this notion of accumulation. So white light, white noise being all the audible frequencies within the range of human hearing. And that was the kind of beautiful impression I had of what the piece would be like, but in fact it was much more like the image you just saw. It was so crowded that you couldn't get a sense of the flicker of the lights as people moved through it, and then the fading away. And that was the first lesson for me about public space, that once you put it out, Once you go public, you don't know what will happen, and you can't really predict people's behaviors. And what was interesting about the piece was that everyone wanted to break it, and they wanted to break it in order to figure out essentially how it worked, which was interesting. So, a decade ago, custom microcontroller, cheap speaker, these were mounted underneath a raised deck. But what was interesting was that people would invent ways to inhabit it. We saw people invent games within the field, and people would just love to hang out in that space. So I mentioned the kind of notion of cultural difference about personal space, and I think this notion of difference is part of my work. This is from Rudofsky's book. He's famous for writing a book called Architecture Without Architects. But this illustration, he's comparing a Japanese garment, a kimono, with a Western garment. And on the left, he demonstrates that the cultural bias is towards a kind of efficiency and no waste in terms of the use of material. And so the kimono is really based on the linearity of the bolt of fabric, and size and curvature is taken up by things like the fold, whereas the Western garment, which privileges the contours of the body, leaves these kind of residual pieces of the garment. And so I wanted to kind of synthesize these two ideas and create a garment. And this is the Mobius dress. And essentially, it is a literal Mobius strip that's turned into a wearable garment. And the idea is to combine both the curvature of the Western garment and the efficiency of the kimono, and to create a very, very long linear Mobius strip with a super long custom zipper, so that it can essentially be, this Mobius strip can be worn, essentially to be unworn, and as it unravels, the body structures the form of the garment in different ways. So in terms of responsiveness, I think that architecture has a way of creating relationships between content and context in the public sphere. Also, about a decade ago, I was asked to do an exhibition, and this was what was given to me. It was a itemized spreadsheet of about 400 Aztec artifacts. And the curator wanted to display these objects in the Guggenheim Museum. And the first thing I learned was that the Guggenheim Museum was too small, that because of the geometry of the Guggenheim along the ramps, there wasn't going to be enough surface area to accommodate all these artifacts. So the design idea became about creating surplus surface. And in order to do that, there was a very simple formula of undulating in and out a wall. And all of those objects had certain criteria associated with them, depending on which lending institution they came from. So certain objects needed to be behind glass, others didn't have to be. There were issues of scale. And so it was the first time where I designed something via a spreadsheet. Essentially, what we did was create these pocket parameters where every artifact was essentially tagged with the way that the wall needed to behave that housed it around it to create a mediation, essentially, between housing the artifact and the context of the Guggenheim and its ramps. And it became a really useful design tool and visualization tool to move back and forth with the curator, who constantly change the sequence and order of these artifacts until the very last minute. And the wall is clad in half-inch thick felt, and the other thing it did to transform this public space was it absorbed not only light, but sound. So it created this deep, dark, mute envelope, and I guess you can tell because this is actually a very live space, but acoustics affects how you understand public space. And so here at the Guggenheim, for the first time, this kind of deadening silence instead of the live bouncing of noise altered your tempo, your perception of the artifacts. And here you can see every object is on its own custom size, perfect pocket or shelf, and then they're smoothed out together. And when you get to the top, what I did was I pulled in the wall so that you would go up on one side, and then when you come down, because that's the most annoying thing about the Guggenheim, you have to go up the 5th floor ramp to the 6th floor and then backtrack. And so I wanted to actually help Frank Lloyd Wright complete his loop. So essentially, you come up the backside, you see all the large artifacts that didn't fit in the system, and then you come back down on this side. And when you come back down on the other side, these are the environmental vitrines for the really precious artifacts. And in order to see them, you essentially have to get right up against that felt wall. And this is the view looking down. So this notion of responsiveness to context, I think, also refers to the environment as well. I was asked to do a public space project in Phoenix, and it seemed that the only way to create public space outdoors in Phoenix was essentially to create shade. So the project became about creating shade through this notion of a public parasol. I'm, as you saw earlier, fascinated by Mobius strips, and so essentially the unit for this shade device was a Mobius strip, a very efficient strip. But what was important about the geometry was that in certain angles, it would cast a shadow to create shade, and in other angles, it would frame light through a shadow. So the project is called Shadow Play, and it clusters these Mobius strips together to create this public parasol. The public space is in a traffic island, and a triangular traffic island. And what was really important was to understand the relationship of the shade and shadow based on different months of the year, depending on the solar angle, and to make sure in the hottest moments there was maximum shade, but in other parts of the day, morning and evening, there were opportunities actually to see the sky, to create ventilation, and to cast these dappled light shadows. And what also became really important was how to minimize the amount of material to create this shade. So these are a series of different iterations that look at the geometry and the structure of that geometry and how much material it would take. So these are different deflections of different geometric iterations of those units, and you can see that depending on the geometry, they torque and twist and deflect in different ways. And through these studies, we were able to reduce the amount of material by, I think, 20 tons, which was quite substantial, and reduce both cost and material use. So it's super thin, almost feels paper thin. It's currently under construction, and it should be done in a few days. Weeks, sorry, I said days, weeks. I wish it were done in a few days. But the top of this canopy has solar panels, and so at night, it emits the light. I think the other thing about public projects is they make visible things that maybe are people are less aware of. And so this is part of an environmental series. This one's called Windscreen. And with very, very cheap materials, I think all of these things cost, if you add them together, $2.50. To create a micro wind turbine and to affix it to a building at MIT that is notorious for its wind. It's called the Green Building because the wind's coming across the river and then it goes up this tower and then back down. So in the portico, we hung these small windscreens for MIT's 150th anniversary. And the idea was just simply to make visible this natural, abundant, renewable resource that's around us all the time. And basically the speed of the wind, the angles of the wind, is generating the light quite literally through the kind of mechanical movement of the turbine. Nothing's stored, it's just purely made visible. And this idea of making something visible in order to mediate is something that's interested me in the architectural work as well. And so a few years ago, had an opportunity to design a space for the Boston Society of Architects. They had a competition because they were moving from a very vertical building to adaptive reuse building in which they were getting a large square footage on the second floor of the building. The BSA has a kind of notorious old boy reputation, insular, and so this became an opportunity, I thought, in the competition to really celebrate it as a public space. And so part of the program brief was it had 20,000 square feet of space, but 5,000 square feet was dedicated to public gallery. So for the competition, what we thought was important to do was, given it's on the second floor, be very strategic about it. So how do you get someone to pay attention and know something might be accessible in public on a second floor? So we gave it this bright green ceiling. And then the key was really, how do you scoop people up to get them to that second floor? So we wanted to create a super figure that extended beyond each of those kinds of windows, something unusual that would draw people in. And then what we did was we pushed all the office spaces and administrative spaces towards the back and put the conference rooms interspersed in the middle as islands in order to essentially create a mixing chamber between the architects, the students, and the public, but fundamentally to give up all of the perimeter to the public gallery space. So this was a risk in the competition because they didn't ask for that much gallery, and we turned the whole thing into public gallery. But somehow it won, and the BSA has really transformed because of this set of spatial relationships. So the stair is made super thin. It becomes the ceiling, which then has the infrastructure for all the exhibitions in terms of lighting and tracks to hang work. And we thought it was important to have the gallery on the perimeter so you could always be aware that what was happening and being exhibited in the galleries was clearly having an impact or transformative of the urban context, or could be if people were willing to think that way. The kind of strongest element of the space was the stair to get the public up one floor. And we wanted to make it, again, paper thin and use that surface as a mediated surface. And so here, this is the BSA Twitter feed projected on the stair to kind of draw people in. So this notion of communication, I think, is very important in the public sphere. And I think as you can see in my work, I often use light because I think light is communicative, and I love this, if one, if by land, two, if by sea, that very simple on-off can actually have a powerful, powerful message. A few years ago, I was asked by the General Service Administration to create a light installation at the U.S.-Mexico border in San Ysidro. It's the largest land port in the United States, and they were making it even larger. Apparently, it could take up to 6 hours to cross this border by car. So they were expanding the lanes to 27 lanes, and this is designed by Miller Hull. And I was asked to create some art here. And I was like, okay, what do I do? There's really no site, and I really, so I decided to be very minimal and almost minimal and integral with the piece. So it's called Double Horizon, and all I did was create a linear light fixture essentially under the canopy. But the light fixture, what it does is it basically real-time shows the movement of cars through these multiple security checks as they go through. And so this drawing shows that, there's, I don't know how many sensors there are, but there are over 30 sensors for every car in terms of the things that are being measured and scanned and weighed as every vehicle goes through. So the piece was very simple, that there would be a kind of flicker of light every time a car passed through the security check, that light would kind of flicker outwards, and as other cars move through the 28 lanes, that it would also create a kind of moment and a ripple, and then these would interface with each other. Very simple idea. Really hard to do at the U.S. border between, because of all the issues of security. And so even though there are so many sensors and all of this data is being recorded, we were unable to access or tap into any data. And in fact, they wouldn't even allow us to run our fiber optic cable in the same conduit as the other fiber optic cable for fear of adjacency. So we had to do a workaround, which basically is able to, without tapping into their infrastructure or information, know when a light is switching from red to green or when there's a change in current. And we tap into that information in order to create Double Horizon. So this is one evening a few months ago. You can see the light rippling through, and you can see this pretty far back, and something to pass the time as your 6-hour wait has been reduced to now about 40 minutes. So this idea of data and public space, I think, is really a new field. And recently I was asked to do a sculpture for Dudley Square in Roxbury in front of a new building for public education. And the sculpture is, very literally a sculpture. But what we wanted it to do was actually reflect the citizens' engagement with the city. So Boston has been pretty innovative with new urban mechanics, and they have an app called Citizens Connect where you can take a picture of a pothole and report it, and take a picture of a broken sign and report it, or note when there's trash removal that needs to be done, very, very banal stuff. But I think what's so interesting about it is it's a direct communication feed between the citizens and the city has to respond back or take action within a certain duration of time. So the sculptural piece, which is a kind of unrolled map of the city of Boston with the different neighborhoods, is recording in real time and playing back all the reports made through Citizens Connect to the city. And each of them are tagged in terms of what kind of report is made, how the city is responding, and as those tickets are essentially closed out, the light begins to fade. And what's interesting is you see that certain areas are clearly more app used, there are more app users, and it reflects the demographic of the city as well. So you see a difference between the affluent areas and the less affluent areas in the city, which I think is important to register back to the city and its citizens. And so this is a kind of simulation of the piece, and it's currently under construction. So the other thing about public space, I alluded to it earlier, is the rules of engagement and questions we put out there. So, my husband's actually a little bit germophobic, and so he won't touch anything in public space, like a subway. He won't grab onto the bar and these kinds of things. And I was curious, will people touch things in public space? So we were asked to do a project in Dubai, and again, it was a sound installation, and we were asked if we could do something with bird songs, so sure. But for me, what was interesting to test in this piece, which is in a mall, is will people want to touch a urban instrument? So the piece is basically a series of light poles with capacitance, and it's all handmade, and a speaker, and then this is a little cone that helps to diffuse the sound through the pole. And you can see if people want to touch things in public space. So you can, based on your gesture, you can throw light in different directions. You can, see, they touch things in public space. And the goal was to create something that the kids would touch, that the adults would touch, that people would feel like they could play this thing in public space and really interact with it regardless of age. And he's really enjoying that. Yeah. So that was a little experiment in terms of capacitance, but also gesture, and if people would intuitively know that you could throw light in either direction. And it was clear, people tapped it, but it wasn't fully engaging. And recently we finished a project called Swing Time in Boston, and we thought it would be important they wanted to create an installation that really engaged the public, that would be playful, and we thought it would be interesting to take on something pretty familiar, like a tire swing, something very summer fun, and make it both defamiliar and refamiliar at the same time. So the idea was to create this like mega swing set that was interactive, that basically responded to people in terms of the angle in which they swung. Here's a short clip about that. You can see being alone. It's really lovely when you're by yourself. So it's a very low-tech kind of project. It's a temporary installation, so there's a accelerometer, and depending on the angle that you swing, the light changes to reward you for, the higher you go. And we wanted the swing set, even in terms of the structure, to seem somewhat familiar but out of scale, so that as an adult you feel, like a kid again in terms of scale. And then this year we added solar panels to it, so it's completely off-grid and powered by the sun. And so recently it opened. The opening event had 3,000 people. It was very well loved. And in fact, the client was telling us it's being loved to death, in that people are using it so much that it is breaking constantly. So we were asked to make a sign about what is allowed and what is not allowed on the swing, and we put these signs everywhere. But despite all the signage, they're used by the public the way the public wants to use them. So the other great addition to this installation is there's a bar right next door, and this public park allows drinking in public space. And so alcohol, swings, you kind of get it, right? So this is a collection of some of our kind of favorite images. People love to take selfies on it. People do strange things. People are not supposed to stand on it. And of course, I love it that people make out in the swings. So it's a swing for one, for two. It makes adults play. You can play alone, you can play together. But I think going back to the items on the list about interactive public space, it's got to be fun. It's not often that you get to think about public space, fun, playfulness in terms of architecture, but we were recently asked to design the first circus conservatory in America. This will be built in Portland, Maine. And we were looking at these old archival documents trying to explain the circus, and these like hybrid words that they would use to explain it. And we love this idea of hybridity, which I think is present in many of our projects, but how to bring this kind of notion to the design of the circus, and what you could put together to create the new Conservatorium. So the Circus Conservatory of America will be part classroom. It'll be training for higher education. So it'll be the first bachelor's degree granting circus conservatory in the United States. But in addition to the classroom, it has this training room. And so the client came to us actually with this beautiful sketch from The Little Prince of the Hat Elephant, and asked us if we could design a circus around that notion. So one of the first things we learned is there's this interesting metric, even in Cirque du Soleil today, based on this 42-foot diameter circle. And that diameter is actually based on the perfect radius a horse can run around in a circle. And that has determined, a certain realm of performance arts for hundreds of years. So we wanted to bring the circus, the elephant, the hat together, and we started designing all kinds of things. Just crazy, but when you're trying to design something with the goal of just difference, it's very hard to latch onto something. So we went back to the kind of clarity of the hybrid between training and education. And this is the site, Thompson's Point. And basically, we took these kind of rigid program elements, and instead of forcing a circle geometry, we actually just put them in the round, literally, with each other. This essentially allowed us to take the big training volumes, to lift them up in space in the round, to give them these amazing views out on Thompson Point, so that when you're in the practice room, you have this incredible vista outwards, but also allow them to look inward through the kind of public shared space at each other, similar to this layering that's in Tricia Brown's work. So it has both an inward and outward focus, and then we stitch those training spaces together to create these in-between public spaces that weren't really for any prescriptive use, which we think is really important to generating kind of grassroots publicness. And then by lifting the Circus Conservatory up, we allow for the public to actually move in and under the school for the performances. And the last project I wanted to share is about public space and memory. This is a memorial to Sean Collier, who was an officer who was shot immediately following the Boston Marathon bombings on MIT's campus. And designing a memorial in present day, when we have, we're saturated by digital media, it was a challenge to design this memorial. And I remember seeing this sign as I went into the Boston Tunnel, and I thought it was really powerful and amazing, but it was fleeting. It was like a flicker, and it was gone. After Sean died, there were many temporary memorials that popped up along the city, and then also on the site where he was shot and killed. And after his death, at the 1-year anniversary, there was this incredible outpouring from the MIT community, and this notion of MIT Strong was very, very present, and also this term mens et manus, mind and hand, and strength. So when I was asked by the MIT committee to design this memorial, I had a lot of reservations. I'm not sure I'm the right person for this. It has to deal with metaphor and meaning, which is, very uncomfortable for an architect to deal with in this contemporary day and age. But I said I would try. And so the first idea was simply to deal with this notion of hand and mind. The committee really wanted it to be very of MIT. So maybe you could take the open hand and turn it into a structure. They also did something very MIT in that they created an open call to the whole community. And everybody submitted different ideas of what the memorial could be. And my job essentially was to synthesize these different ideas. One that kept reappearing was that of the cairn, the kind of stacking of boulders because of Sean's love of hiking and the outdoors, the notion of the forest. A lot of people wanted an American flag on the site. And the challenge was how to bring all of these together so it wasn't an aggregate of these different ideas, but try to find the essence of what people were really struggling with. And I remember thinking about the simple star at the CIA for unnamed agents who are killed in the line of duty. And so that was a way, a five-pointed figure was a way to address this issue of the American flag without a literal American flag there. So this is where Sean was shot. It's between the Stata and the Koch building, two very massive, iconic, at least the Stata by Frank Gehry, iconic buildings. And so the committee really wanted the site to be very close to that location. So remember this X. So we took this planted area and turned that essentially into the site. I mentioned the five-pointed figure. The idea was to take a void out of that figure, and that Boolean or that absence would always be present as that kind of figure of the cairn or the figure that was missing, the loss of Sean Collier. The other thing about the five fingers is that it allows us to create multiple spaces and create a really porous memorial. So it's not purely a wall, but it's a threshold, it's a gateway, it's a space, and reminds people that MIT's campus is an open campus, and we're not going to close and make artificial gates, etc., but to celebrate that openness, but to create a kind of moment of pause within that gateway into campus. Then the other thing that was constantly in my mind were these Inca walls that were made out of massive, massive blocks of stone, each completely unique and doing exactly what it needs to do structurally. So the idea for how to build the memorial came from thinking of every piece as coming together. There are 32 of these large blocks that essentially come together to create a vault, a five-walled vault, and that's the keystone in the middle. So it uses pure physics and geometry. There's redundancy in it, so you can even remove a block and the loads span. And so it was important that we do this with that level of integrity and literalness. The first meeting with the structural engineer, they said, oh, you can cast it out of concrete and clad it in stone. Actually, that's what the contractor said. The engineer wanted to post-tension it, to put a lot of steel in it. And we insisted that we wanted this absolutely flattest possible dome, but built using these ancient techniques of the Incas. In order to do that, we had to build in the ability to calculate the forces as we were designing the geometry. So we made a design tool, or our engineers helped us develop this design tool that enabled us to kind of calculate the load every time we dealt with a wall. And so here you can see when the forces go outside that wall, basically it won't stand. So the thrust line has to resolve itself within the kind of third point of the wall, otherwise it doesn't work. So that led to many iterations of different geometries that could work. And the final geometry was one that creates a window between two of the walls that are closest together to the actual spot where Sean was killed. Each of these pieces is unique and comes apart. There are small pins, steel pins that kind help with the alignment and placing them together, and then do some structural work in lateral movement for an earthquake. So each of those blocks came from a quarry in Virginia. This is the Jet Mist Quarry. And one of the things that I learned that was shocking was that these quarries have only a 15% recovery rate, right? So that means 85% is thrown away, which if you go, it's just from a material point of view, this was astonishing. So one of the things, and it's because there's tiny cracks and little green veins and these kinds of things that make them not perfect for kitchen counters, but for us, they were perfect. Every block could be used because we had such unique blocks. And so we would go hang out with giant rocks with our laptops and try to figure out how to three-dimensionally carve these pieces out of these blocks. So there's some massive saws to do that. We used computer numerically controlled saws and robot arms, and the project was really one of subtraction. So from the first loss of the Boolean operation in the figured structure to the kind of removal of material and the carving of each of these individual blocks. The texture is kind of amazing, and but you can see the blade sometimes is going cutting and then sometimes going cross grain, and so it's essentially scraping material off the blocks as it gets finer and finer in terms of that surface. So what was very important about the project was that the geometry was, because we wanted it to work through geometry and physics and not through post-tensioning or steel, it meant that the tolerance issues were absolutely tight, that we could not be more than 2 millimeters off in any direction for the geometry to work. And we thought that was fine because, we have computer numerically controlled saws and robot arms and, computational tools, and it'll be fine. But the problem was you need material to remove material. And so the saw blades, as they were cutting, so some of these blocks took 24 hours a day over 7 days. So they were running 3 shifts just to carve sometimes one block. And so over that duration, the blade itself would wear. And there was no way to calculate how much the blade would wear over how much time. So we were getting blocks that did have millimeters of difference. And so as each block was completed, they were measured. These were then registered with the exact dimensions, and then we would compare with our computer file and decide whether to make an adjustment in the next block or not. In addition to that, the structure, because of its massive weight, it's 140 tons, it sits on 33 mini piles that go between 30 and 45 feet below grade. And that site I showed you at the very beginning between the Stata and the Koch, apparently that's where all the power to MIT comes through. And it comes through this duct. So we had to be very careful to span and not, have any of this massive load compress on the duct itself. There's the keystone. There's a shelf in the keystone. It doesn't have any pins, just pure geometry and gravity. They brought every block one by one as it was fabricated. It was then shipped to the site and puzzle pieced together. And it was built inside out. So we started with the keystone, which is kind of reverse of how you would think of doing it. And there was a temporary scaffold in place. That temporary scaffold was there so that when we lowered the scaffold, we would know how much the blocks moved and whether our calculations and our engineers' calculations were correct. So there were strain gauges put in every crack, and there were weights, these massive scales, put under the scaffold to make sure that as the scaffold was being lowered, so there was a little dial on each one where we could lower it micrometer by micrometer, essentially, and then just make sure that the loads and the thrust lines were behaving as we expected. And so these were being registered, and it worked. And the construction team felt comfortable standing under it, which they were very worried to do all along. And the last element of the design piece has again to do with memory and time, and that was how to inscribe not permanence on the site of this public space, but this notion of a kind of single moment in time, the time he was shot. So what we did was we took the constellation of stars the night Sean was shot. So if he looked up, this is the constellation he would see, and we put those constellations in the ground plane. He was 27, so there's 27 points of light, and this is the kind of first night that it opened. So it's become a public space at MIT, and as a memorial, of course, there is a sense of somberness and pause as you move through that arch or vault underneath. This is the portal that's the window to where he was shot. There's raised lettering to prevent the skateboarders from going up on the edge. But really the memorial frames many of these moments, but it also creates a kind of openness on campus. And there's a beautiful quote by his brother, who was also the project manager on site. Live long like Eyeo, big hearts, big smiles, big service, all love. And I think for me, it's been really interesting to see how loved this memorial has become within the public space of MIT. And you see crazy stuff. You see kids sliding down this, sliding down the curve. I'm waiting for the MIT hack where there'll probably be a football team standing on top of the memorial. But I think for me, what was very critical and eye-opening was that now that it is in the public sphere, it's no longer mine, and it's the public's. Thank you.